7 advisors of the mafia boss failed until the cocktail waitress said one sentence that saved him $200 million and an entire gang war. And what he did next shook the entire underworld to its core. This is absolutely unacceptable. Gabriel Cross's voice cut through the private VIP room like a blade slicing through flesh. The 37-year-old crime lord slammed his fist against the black oak table with a force that made every glass tremble. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, with the so-called sharpest minds in my organization, and we are still exactly where we started. Around the massive table, 7 advisors exchanged uncomfortable glances with one another. Dark circles carved deep beneath eyes that had witnessed things most people only saw in nightmares. Custom-tailored suits wrinkled from days spent locked inside the underground chamber of Black Diamond Club, sleepless nights and sacrificed weekends, all for absolutely nothing. $200 million. That was what hung in the balance, frozen in a Swiss bank account that refused to release a single cent. Richard Castellano, the gray-haired senior accountant, adjusted his designer glasses and dared to speak up, explaining that they were exploring every legal loophole available, that this kind of international money laundering complication had no simple solution. Gabriel responded immediately with eyes that could freeze hell itself, asking whether there truly was no simple solution or whether everyone seated at this table was simply too incompetent to find one, reminding them that he paid each of them 7-figure salaries specifically to handle problems exactly like this, and that the last person who disappointed him was now resting at the bottom of the Hudson River. The VIP room felt like a battlefield after weeks of relentless warfare. Crumpled documents piled high at the edges of the table. The whiteboard was covered with numbers, formulas, and financial charts that stubbornly refused to make any sense. Gabriel had inherited nothing when his father was betrayed and murdered by his closest partner 19 years ago. He had built the Cross Empire from ashes and blood with his own 2 hands, transforming himself from an 18-year-old boy with nothing into the most feared name on the entire East Coast. 19 years of building, conquering, eliminating rivals, and now he was trapped, held hostage by one anti-money laundering clause that 7 extremely expensive advisors could not solve. At that exact moment, when the tension had reached its absolute peak, the door opened quietly. Scarlett Hayes walked in, pushing a service cart, the soft sound of wheels on marble floor cutting through the suffocating silence like a whisper in a graveyard. She wore the simple black uniform of the club's service staff, invisible, just like always. No one looked at her. No one ever did. To them, Scarlett was merely part of the furniture, no different from the leather chairs or the dim chandeliers hanging overhead. The cocktail waitress, $9 an hour to serve drinks and remain invisible to everyone around her. 6 months of the same routine, entering that room 5 or 6 times every single day, always ignored, always overlooked, always treated as if she did not exist. But Scarlett saw everything, and she understood far more than anyone in that room could possibly imagine. As she reached for an empty glass near the whiteboard, her sharp eyes, trained by 4 intensive years studying finance at Columbia University, caught the scribbled numbers, the complex formulas, the projected cash flow charts going in every possible direction. And then she saw it. The mistake so obvious, so painfully basic, that Scarlett had to bite her lip hard to keep from laughing out loud in front of the most dangerous men in New York City. They were using the wrong regulatory framework entirely. If you want to discover the satisfying lines Scarlett uttered to save $200 million, hit the like button now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what Gabriel Cross does next that will leave everyone speechless. Because sometimes, all it takes is 30 seconds of courage to change everything. Scarlett kept clearing away the empty glasses in silence, trying to keep her hands from shaking after what she had just discovered. She knew she should stay quiet, keep doing her job, and walk out of the room as if nothing had happened, because that was what a girl earning $9 an hour pouring drinks was supposed to do. Yet at the very moment she was telling herself this was none of her business, David Chen, the legal advisor with a Harvard degree and an arrogance so sharp it was almost painful, waved for more liquor without even looking at her. Scarlett stepped closer, carefully pouring the whiskey into the crystal glass with the precision of someone who had performed the motion thousands of times. David Chen reached for the glass with his eyes still glued to his laptop screen and, in a carelessness that felt almost cruel, knocked half of the hot drink straight onto Scarlett's hand and uniform. The amber liquid seeped through the thin fabric and burned her skin like fire, making her draw in a sharp breath of pain while no one in the room turned around. David Chen merely muttered "Be careful" in a flat, cold voice, as if she had spilled something of his rather than he had just burned her. There was no apology, no glance of acknowledgement, not a single second of realizing that she too was a human being who could feel pain. From the corner of the room, Thomas Burke, the casino manager with his heavy build and his habit of bullying the weak, let out a contemptuous snort of laughter. He looked at Scarlett the way one looked at an insect that had just been crushed, and then told the others that at least she knew how to pour a drink even if she could not even manage that properly. A few low chuckles followed. No one defended her. No one saw anything wrong. Scarlett felt her cheeks grow hot. Not from shame but from the anger rising like lava in her chest. The humiliation climbed her throat like acid and burned through every cell in her body. 6 months she had walked into this room day after day serving people who never looked at her, cleaning up the messes they left behind, enduring the crude remarks they threw at her, as if she had no ears to hear them. 6 months she had swallowed the pride of a top graduate from Columbia University, and accepted being treated like a piece of furniture that could move. 6 months she had gone home with aching legs and a broken heart, crying alone in the bathroom so her mother would not worry more. 6 months she had told herself she was doing this for her family, because her mother needed money for surgery, because Tommy needed money for rehabilitation, because she had no other choice. But tonight, with the burn still stinging on her skin, and the mocking laughter still echoing in her ears, Scarlett suddenly realized something. She held a top honors degree in finance from one of the most prestigious universities in the United States. She had once worked for major corporations, handling figures most people could not even begin to understand. She had once been respected, listened to, valued, and now she was standing here, having a drink poured on her by a man not fit to grade her exam, being laughed at by men who could not solve a problem she could handle in her sleep. 7 men with 7-figure salaries could not find what she had seen in 30 seconds. Scarlett took a towel from the service tray and slowly wiped the liquor from her hand in uniform. Her movements were strangely calm, while inside something had shattered. Not her submission, but the last thread that had kept her silent. She lifted her head, her green eyes sharp as blades as they met the room full of powerful men. And before her mind could stop her, before fear could crush her courage, Scarlett opened her mouth and spoke in a clear, cutting voice that did not tremble. Have you tried applying the exception under Section 847B of the United States, Department of the Treasury, issued in the year 2021? Scarlett said, her voice clear and steady in the absolute silence of the room. It solves your problem in 30 seconds. And the silence that followed her words grew so thick it felt as if it could be cut with a knife. 7 heads turned at the same time as if pulled by the same invisible string. 7 pairs of eyes stared in disbelief at the waitress, standing there with the liquor still wet on her uniform, and the towel still in her hand, yet with a gaze sharp as if she had just stepped out of a multinational boardroom rather than from behind a bar. Gabriel Cross, who had been lifting his glass to his lips, froze with his arms suspended in midair, the steel-gray eyes of the Mafia boss drilling into Scarlett with an intensity she had never felt before. Not anger, not contempt, but something else. A raw curiosity mixed with surprise. And Richard Castellano was the first to break the silence with a mocking snort, asking whether a waitress really thought she understood international financial law, and telling her to go back to pouring drinks and let the adults do their work, while David Chen nodded in agreement, adding that she was clearly insane and ordering someone to call security to throw her out immediately. And Thomas Burke rose to his feet and started towards Scarlett, with the intention of dragging her from the room by force if necessary. But before he could touch her, Gabriel's voice cut through the air with only 2 words, "Stand still," heavy as stone and cold as ice. And Thomas Burke froze where he was. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Gabriel set his glass on the table, stood up, and walked slowly towards Scarlett, each step of the Mafia boss echoing on the marble floor like the countdown of a timed bomb, and Scarlett felt the danger radiating from him like heat from a fire. Yet she did not step back, did not lower her head, did not let fear take over her eyes, and Gabriel stopped exactly 1 step away from her, close enough for her to smell the expensive cologne mixed with whiskey, close enough for her to see the faint scar on the left side of his chin. "What did you just say?" Gabriel asked, his voice low and dangerous like the growl of a beast assessing its prey. And Scarlett swallowed, not from fear but because she knew this was the decisive moment. She took a deep breath and began to explain, her voice growing more confident as she entered territory she truly understood. Section 847B of the United States, Department of the Treasury, issued in the year 2021, created an important exception in international anti-money laundering regulations, Scarlett said. This provision allows investments into commercial real estate to be exempt from Tier 3 anti-money laundering screening, provided that the transaction is tied to a development project that creates at least 100 jobs and has a minimum investment value of $50 million, and she paused for a second to let the figures sink into the minds, said to be the sharpest in the room before continuing. If you restructure the current transaction into an investment in a hotel or commercial center project, the Swiss bank will have no legal basis to hold the funds. $200 million will be released within 72 working hours. And Scarlett looked straight into Gabriel's gray eyes without blinking. You are using the legal framework of the year 2018 as your reference. That is the mistake. Section 847B changed everything 3 years ago. This is basic knowledge in finance. Any first-year student knows this. And the silence that covered the room afterward was heavier than before. The 7 advisors looked at one another as if they had been struck, some lowering their heads in embarrassment, others still trying to digest what had just happened. And Gabriel Cross, the famously ruthless mafia boss of the East Coast, for the first time in his life did not know how to respond to a waitress. Gabriel said nothing. The mafia boss slipped his phone from the inside pocket of his suit jacket, his gray eyes never leaving Scarlett as if he were trying to read her soul through his gaze. He pressed a speed dial number and lifted the phone to his ear, his voice cold and authoritative when he spoke. Klaus, I need you to verify something right now, Gabriel said in flawless English, without a trace of hesitation. Section 847B of the United States, Department of the Treasury, issued in the year 2021. The exemption clause for commercial real estate investment. Does it apply to our case? The room fell into a tense, suffocating silence, while Gabriel listened to the voice on the other end of the line. 5 minutes passed like 5 hours. Scarlett stood there, her heart beating like a war drum, yet her outward calm was almost astonishing. She did not know who Klaus was, but from the way Gabriel spoke, she guessed he was a senior lawyer in Switzerland, perhaps the one directly handling the legal issues of the frozen bank account. Richard Castellano shot her a look filled with hatred, as if she had just stolen something that belonged to him. David Chen folded his arms across his chest, his expression still disdainful but now cracked by a thin line of worry. Thomas Burke stood frozen in the corner of the room, not daring to move since Gabriel had ordered him to stop. The other 4 advisors sat like stone statues, none of them daring to breathe too loudly. Then Gabriel lowered the phone. He did not hang up immediately, standing there in silence for a few more seconds as if absorbing what he had just heard. When he turned back, the usual cold mask on his face held something different. Not a smile. Gabriel Cross never smiled, but a strange light in his steel-gray eyes. She is right, Gabriel said. 2 short words that fell like a hammer on the heads of the 7 advisors. Klaus confirms that Section 847B fully applies to our case. If we restructure the transaction into an investment in a hotel project, the funds will be released within 72 hours. Exactly as she said. No one dared to speak. Gabriel began to walk slowly around the conference table, each step echoing like the knock of death itself. He stopped behind Richard Castellano, placed a hand on the gray-haired chief accountant's shoulder, and tightened it just enough to make the man shudder. How much do I pay you each year, Richard? Gabriel asked, his voice almost gentle in a way that was terrifying. Richard swallowed and answered that it was $800,000, sir. $800,000, Gabriel repeated, nodding slowly. And you could not find what a $9 an hour waitress saw in 30 seconds. Gabriel released Richard's shoulder and moved on to David Chen. And you, the Harvard lawyer who calls himself an expert in international financial law, would you care to explain why you were busy spilling liquor on a waitress instead of doing the job I pay you for? David Chen opened his mouth to speak, but Gabriel raised a hand for silence. I do not want to hear excuses, Gabriel said, his voice cold as ice. I pay the 7 people sitting here more than $5 million a year in total. $5 million for you to sit here for 3 weeks, drink my expensive liquor, sleep in my 5-star hotels, and still be unable to solve a problem that a 27-year-old woman in a waitress uniform solved in less than a minute. Gabriel turned back, and this time he looked directly at Scarlett, truly looked at her for the first time as a human being rather than an invisible ghost. His gray eyes met her green ones, and in that moment something changed. Scarlett did not know what it was, but she felt it like an electric current running along her spine. Who are you? Gabriel asked, not with the tone of a mafia boss interrogating a subordinate, but with the genuine curiosity of a man who had just encountered something that surprised him. And in Gabriel Cross's world, surprise was a luxury he rarely experienced. Who are you? The question echoed in Scarlett's mind like the toll of a bell, pulling her back into a memory she had tried to bury for 15 years. Who was she? She was the 12-year-old child standing in a small grocery store in Brooklyn on a winter evening, her hand tightly holding the hand of her 2-year-old brother Tommy, while her father stood behind the cash register counting the last loose coins of the day. She was the child laughing with her little brother, choosing candy from the shelf, when the door flew open and two dark figures stepped inside with masks pulled over their heads. She was the child who saw a gun for the first time in her life, not in a movie, not in a book, but in the hands of a stranger pointing it straight at her father's chest. She was the child who heard her father say in a trembling voice that the money was there. "Take it all. Just do not hurt my children." She was the witness when one of the two robbers, the taller one with eyes cold as stone, pulled the trigger without a second of hesitation, even after her father had handed over all the money in the register. Scarlett remembered the sound of the gunshot, not like in the movies, louder, sharper, more merciless. She remembered the way her father fell, slowly, like in a dream, his hand still clutching the stack of bills as if that could save his life. She remembered the red, so much red, spreading across the white tile floor of the grocery store like a terrible painting, and she remembered the only thing she could do in that moment, the instinct of a 12-year-old sister, to turn and cover Tommy's eyes with her small hands, press his face into her stomach so he would not have to see their father lying there, would not have to see the blood, would not have to see death. Tommy cried, not understanding what was happening, only knowing that his sister was holding him very tightly and trembling. Scarlett did not cry, not because she was strong, but because she had forgotten how to cry. She only stood there, covering her brother's eyes, watching her father breathe his last on the cold floor, while the two robbers ran away with a few $100s in their hands, leaving behind a shattered family. The police came, the ambulance came, but everything was too late. Scarlett's father, the man who had worked 14 hours a day to support his wife and two children, the man who had taught her to read, to do mathematics, who had taught her that education was the only way out of poverty, was gone forever because of a few $100s in a cash register. Scarlett's mother, Helen Hayes, collapsed completely. She did not eat, did not sleep, did not speak to anyone for the first 3 months. She sat by the window from morning until night, staring at the street where her husband's grocery store had once existed, as if by looking long enough she could make him walk through the door and say that everything had only been a bad dream. Scarlett, at 12 years old, had to learn how to cook for her 2-year-old brother. Scarlett, at 12 years old, had to learn how to change diapers, mix formula, rock him to sleep when her mother no longer had the strength to do anything. Scarlett, at 12 years old, had to grow up overnight, carrying the responsibility of an adult, while still being a child who needed protection. She had sworn to herself on the night of her father's funeral, standing beside the cheap wooden coffin her family could barely afford, that she would study hard, would succeed, would take her mother and her brother out of this life of poverty. She would never again allow her family to suffer any more pain. And now, standing in the VIP room of a mafia boss, with the question of who she was still hanging in the air, Scarlett suddenly realized how cruel a sense of humor life could have. That vow carried Scarlett through the hardest years of her life. She studied like a madwoman, not out of love for knowledge, but because it was the only path she could see out of the poor neighborhood in Brooklyn, out of the cramped apartment with its damp, mold-stained walls, out of the fear that one day she would have to watch her mother or her brother fall the way her father had. She won a full scholarship to Columbia University, one of the most prestigious schools in the United States, and over the next 4 years she proved that she belonged there. Scarlett graduated with honors, in the top 5% of her class, with a finance degree any company would have coveted. On the day she received her diploma, her mother cried, the first time she had cried from happiness since her husband died. Tommy, then 13 years old, hugged his sister and told her he was prouder of her than of anyone else in the world. Scarlett thought life was finally beginning to smile on her family. She was hired by Sterling Financial, one of the largest financial firms in New York, with a starting salary she would never have dared to dream of when she had been a child counting loose coins in her father's grocery store. She rented a small but clean apartment for her mother, sent money every month so Tommy could focus on his studies instead of taking extra jobs, and for the first time in her life she felt she could breathe without worrying about tomorrow. But life has its own way of reminding people that happiness never lasts long. After 2 years of outstanding performance at Sterling Financial, Scarlett was promoted to senior analyst, working directly under Jonathan Reed, the head of the finance division. Reed was a 50-year-old man, with neatly groomed silver hair and a smile that was always warm in front of his superiors. But behind closed doors, he was a venomous snake, ready to bite anyone who stood in his way. One late evening, when the office was empty, Reed called Scarlett into his office and placed a stack of documents in front of her. He asked her to adjust a few numbers in the quarterly financial report. Just a few small changes, he said. No one would notice, and it would make the company look better to investors. Scarlett looked at the figures, at the requested changes, and she understood immediately that they were not small changes at all. This was financial fraud, a federal crime, something that could send her to prison if discovered. She refused. She looked Jonathan Reed in the eye and told him she could not do this, that it was illegal, that she would not sacrifice her career and her freedom to cover for anyone. Reed did not get angry. He only smiled, a smile so cold it was frightening, and said she would regret this decision. 2 days later, Scarlett was fired for failing to meet performance expectations. There was no written warning, no performance review, no chance to explain. There was only a box of her personal belongings and 2 security guards escorting her out of the building like a criminal. But that was only the beginning. Jonathan Reed destroyed her reputation throughout the New York financial industry. He told people she had been fired for dishonesty, for falsifying data, for stealing internal information. Every company she applied to rejected her after background checks. Every interview ended with suspicious looks and the phrase, "We will get back to you," that never came true. Within 6 months, Scarlett went from a rising star in finance to someone no one wanted to hire. A name crossed off every list of potential candidates. She had done the right thing. She had refused to take part in a crime, and she was punished for it. Life is fair, people say, but Scarlett knew that was only a lie adults tell children, so they can sleep at night. But fate did not seem satisfied with what it had already dropped on Scarlett's head. As if losing her job and having her reputation destroyed were not enough, life decided to strike her again, with blows that were heavier, closer together, and gave her no time to breathe. 3 months after she was fired, while Scarlett was still desperately looking for work, her mother called from the hospital with a voice so weak, Scarlett almost did not recognize it. Helen Hayes had collapsed in the kitchen, and when the doctors ran tests, they found a malignant tumor in her lung. Stage 3 cancer, the doctor told Scarlett in a grave voice, requiring immediate surgery if she was to have any chance of survival, with an estimated cost of about $200,000, and the health insurance Scarlett once had while working at Sterling Financial had expired the day she was fired. Scarlett stood in the hospital corridor with the phone still pressed to her ear even after the call had ended, and felt the ground fall away beneath her feet. She did not have $200,000. She did not even have $2,000. Her savings were gone after 3 months of unemployment, and no bank would lend money to someone without a job. Then the second call came, this time from the police. Tommy, her brother, the child whose eyes she had covered the night their father was killed, the boy she had sworn to protect at all costs, had been arrested for possession of heroin. Scarlett could not believe it. Tommy, the smart, gentle boy who always smiled and told her he would make her proud, had become an addict without her even knowing it. Later she learned that Tommy had started using drugs after Scarlett lost her job, when he saw his sister, the person he admired most in the world, collapse before his eyes, and felt helpless to do anything about it. He turned to heroin to escape, to forget the feeling of powerlessness, and then he could not stop. Scarlett used the last of her money to post bail for Tommy and put him into a rehabilitation center. Not the best one. She could not afford that, but at least a place that could keep him safe and help him get clean. The monthly cost was $8,000, on top of her mother's mounting hospital bills, on top of $80,000 in student debt from college she still had not finished paying off. Scarlett looked at the numbers and felt as if she were drowning in the ocean, water filling her lungs, no way to reach the surface. She needed money. She needed a job, but no financial firm in New York would hire her after what Jonathan Reed had done. And then she found the Black Diamond Club. The luxury nightclub did not require industry background checks, did not care where she had worked or why she had been fired. They only needed a girl who could pour drinks and keep quiet, and they paid $9 an hour for that. Scarlett took the job immediately, without a second of hesitation. She knew Black Diamond was a place where the underworld operated, knew the men in expensive suits sitting in the VIP rooms were not ordinary businessmen, knew she was pouring drinks for the mafia, but she had no choice. Her mother needed surgery. Tommy needed rehabilitation. And she needed to live, to earn money, to keep fighting no matter how many times life knocked her down. So for 6 months, Scarlett Hayes, former top student at Columbia University, former senior financial analyst, had worn a simple black uniform, pushed a service cart through rooms full of smoke and crude laughter, poured drinks for men who never looked at her, and swallowed her pride every night when she came home with aching legs and a bleeding heart. Until tonight, when she stood in front of Gabriel Cross, the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast, and for the first time in 6 months, someone truly saw her. Scarlett blinked and pulled herself back into the present from the painful memories. She was standing in the VIP room of the Black Diamond Club, with Gabriel Cross in front of her, his gray eyes fixed on her, waiting for an answer. "Who are you?" The question still hung in the air like a challenge. Scarlett took a deep breath and decided to tell the truth. Not all of it, but enough to answer. She said she had graduated with honors in finance from Columbia University, that she had worked as a senior analyst at Sterling Financial for 2 years before being fired, and that now she was pouring drinks here for $9 an hour. Gabriel tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharp as a blade, dissecting every word she spoke in search of what lay beneath. "Why would someone who graduated with honors from Columbia be pouring drinks in my club?" Gabriel asked, his tone not mocking but purely curious. Scarlett was silent for a second, weighing how much to say, then decided she had nothing to lose. She briefly told him about Jonathan Reed, about refusing to falsify the books, about being fired and blacklisted, about no financial firm being willing to hire her anymore. She did not speak of her mother, of Tommy, of the debts crushing her shoulders. Those wounds were too private to lay bare before a stranger, even if that stranger was the most powerful mafia boss in New York. Gabriel listened in silence, his face revealing nothing, but his eyes were different. There was something there, not pity. Scarlett would not accept pity from anyone, but recognition, as if he saw in her something familiar, a resilience he understood. When Scarlett finished, the room fell silent again. The 7 advisors still sat like statues, none of them daring to speak. Then Gabriel did something that stunned everyone in the room, including Scarlett. "I want you to work for me," Gabriel said, his voice not an offer but almost a declaration. "Not as a waitress. As a financial advisor." Scarlett thought she had misheard. She looked at Gabriel, then at the 7 advisors with their mouths hanging open, then back at Gabriel, as if needing confirmation that this was not a cruel joke. "A salary of $200,000 a year," Gabriel continued without waiting for her reaction, "plus performance bonuses. A private office in Cross Tower, starting tomorrow." Richard Castellano jumped to his feet, his face red with anger, saying this was absurd, that one could not hire a waitress as a financial advisor, that she had no experience, no reputation, nothing to prove her competence. Gabriel only glanced at Richard, and the gray-haired man sat down at once as if he had been slapped. "She solved in 30 seconds what the 7 of you could not solve in 3 weeks, Gabriel said coldly. Gabriel's words hung in the air like a cold blade. He turned his gaze toward the 3 advisors who had remained silent throughout the crisis and pointed toward the door, dismissing them instantly for their incompetence. Only the remaining 4 were left to sit in stunned silence, forced to witness the appointment of the woman they had just mocked. Scarlett stood there, her heart pounding like a war drum, her mind spinning with what had just happened. She looked at the stunned faces of the men who had just humiliated her, realizing that in a single moment, her world had shifted forever. $200,000. Enough to pay for her mother's surgery, enough to pay for Tommy's rehabilitation, enough to clear her student debt and start life again. But she was not someone easily swayed by glittering numbers. She had learned not to trust promises. "I have one condition," Scarlett said, her voice steadier than she expected. Gabriel lifted an eyebrow slightly, clearly unaccustomed to anyone daring to set terms with him, but he did not grow angry. Instead, a flicker of interest lit his gray eyes. "Go on," Gabriel said. "I need an advance of $200,000, Scarlett said plainly, without circling around it. "My mother needs cancer surgery. She cannot wait." The silence lasted long enough for Scarlett to think she had gone too far, asked too much, destroyed her only chance. But then Gabriel nodded, a simple motion that carried the weight of a vow. "Fine," he said. "The money will be in your account within 1 hour. Victor, take care of it." A 45-year-old man with a calm face in the corner of the room nodded and took out his phone. Scarlett looked at Gabriel, not knowing what to say. For the first time in a very long while, she felt a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had covered her life for so many months. The next morning, Scarlett stood in front of Cross Tower and looked up at the glass and steel structure rising 40 stories into the New York sky like a declaration of power. She was wearing the only black suit she owned, bought back when she worked at Sterling Financial, and now slightly tight on her body that had grown thinner after months of eating too little. But it was the best she had, and Scarlett Hayes was not someone who arrived late or carelessly dressed on her first day of work. She stepped into the main lobby, where polished black marble reflected the light of crystal chandeliers, and security guards in black suits stood at every corner. A receptionist with a professional smile directed her to the 35th floor, where the offices for the Cross organization's senior financial advisors were located. When the elevator doors opened, Scarlett entered a wide space filled with modern desks, large computer screens, and glass walls overlooking the city. And there, standing beside the reception desk with a smile bright as the sun, was Diana Martinez. Diana, Scarlett's only friend at the Black Diamond Club. The 26-year-old woman with long black hair and brown eyes, always lit with optimism, ran over and hugged Scarlett the moment she saw her. "You did it," Diana whispered into Scarlett's ear, her voice thick with emotion. "I heard last night and I could not believe it. You really did it." Scarlett hugged her back, feeling her eyes sting. For 6 months, Diana had been the only person at Black Diamond who treated her like a human being, the only one who defended her when Thomas Burke harassed her, the only one who knew about her mother and Tommy and the nights Scarlett cried alone in the locker room. "What are you doing here?" Scarlett asked when they let go of each other. Diana grinned and explained that Gabriel Cross had transferred her from the club to an administrative assistant position at Cross Tower, that she would be working on this very floor, that they would see each other every day. Scarlett did not know whether this was coincidence or something Gabriel had arranged, but either way she felt grateful. Having Diana here made the place feel less strange and frightening. Victor Rossi, the calm, middle-aged man Scarlett had seen the night before, appeared and led her to her private office. The room was about 30 square meters, with an oak desk, a high-end leather chair, and a glass wall overlooking the Hudson River. "This is your office," Victor said in a low, even voice. "Gabriel wants you to begin by reviewing the entire financial structure of the organization. All the necessary documents are on the desk." Scarlett nodded, trying not to show how overwhelmed she felt. Victor turned to leave, but before stepping out he paused and added that she should be careful, that not everyone in this building was happy about her arrival. That warning was proven immediately when Scarlett stepped out to get coffee. Richard Castellano was standing in the corridor with David Chen and Thomas Burke, and all three looked at her with eyes cold as ice. Richard did not bother to hide his hatred. The gray-haired man stepped close enough for Scarlett to smell his expensive cologne mixed with contempt, and murmured so only she could hear that she did not belong here, that she was only Gabriel's temporary amusement, that sooner or later he would tire of her and throw her back onto the streets where she belonged. Scarlett looked Richard in the eye without blinking or stepping back and replied in a voice strangely calm that she very much looked forward to proving him wrong. Then she turned and walked away, leaving the three men behind with faces flushed red with anger. Scarlett knew she had just made enemies of powerful people in this organization. She knew they would do everything they could to bring her down, to prove she did not deserve this place. But Scarlett Hayes had survived her father's death, Jonathan Reed's betrayal, 6 months of being treated like trash. She was not afraid of a few men with wounded egos. She had fought her whole life to get here, and she would not let anyone take this chance away from her. During her first 2 weeks at Cross Tower, Scarlett drowned in a mountain of documents so high she nearly forgot to eat and sleep. She arrived at the office at 7 in the morning and left at 11 at night, her eyes bloodshot from staring at computer screens too long, her mind spinning with numbers, transactions, and cash flows running through dozens of shell companies stretching from New York to Switzerland, from the Cayman Islands to Singapore. She studied every file, every contract, every financial report, with the meticulous care of someone who knew this chance might be the last of her life. Diana brought her coffee and sandwiches every day, worried by the dark circles growing deeper under her friend's eyes. But Scarlett only smiled and said she was fine, that she had to do this. And then, on the 14th night, when the building was dark and only her office glowed with pale blue light from the screen, Scarlett found it. Not one flaw, but 3 serious financial vulnerabilities in the cross-organization system. The first lay in the way international payments were processed, creating a legal gray zone that authorities could exploit if they knew where to look. The second involved the ownership structure of the subsidiaries, an error in share allocation that could lead to asset seizure in the event of a federal investigation. But it was the third that made Scarlett read the data 3 times to be sure she was not mistaken. Someone was siphoning money from the organization. Not much, only about $50,000 a month, small enough to go unnoticed in the massive cash flow of the Cross Empire, but large enough that after 2 years the total stolen had grown to more than $1 million. And more troubling, the trail of these transactions led to one of the shell companies controlled by the accounting department, the department headed by Richard Castellano. Scarlett leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding like a war drum. She knew she was holding a bomb that could explode at any moment. If she was wrong, she would be crushed by Richard and his allies. But if she was right, and she knew she was because numbers do not lie, then she had just uncovered a traitor inside the heart of the organization. The next morning, Scarlett asked to see Gabriel. Victor Rossi led her into the boss's office on the 40th floor, a vast room with minimalist decor that still radiated terrifying authority. Gabriel sat behind a black wood desk, his gray eyes curious as she entered. Scarlett did not waste time. She laid 3 folders in front of Gabriel, each detailing one vulnerability with evidence and proposed solutions. She explained each issue clearly and professionally, And when she reached the third, she paused for a second before saying that someone was stealing from the organization, and the trail led to the accounting department. Gabriel listened in silence, his face unreadable. But Scarlett noticed the way his fingers tightened on the arm of his chair when she mentioned the siphoning. When she finished, Gabriel looked at her for so long she began to feel uneasy. Then he spoke in a low, thoughtful voice, that she had done more in 2 weeks than his 7 advisors had done in 2 years. From that day, everything began to change. Gabriel started calling Scarlett into important meetings, asking her opinion on major financial decisions, listening with a focus he rarely gave anyone else. And then one evening, while they were reviewing the quarterly reports, Gabriel suddenly asked if she would like to go to dinner, not to discuss work, just dinner. Scarlett looked up, surprised by the invitation. She met Gabriel's gray eyes and for the first time realized that behind the coldness and danger there was something else, a loneliness she understood better than anyone. The restaurant Gabriel chose was on the top floor of a building in Manhattan, a place so private it did not appear on any map and served only guests who were personally invited. And Scarlett sat across from the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast, feeling out of place in her simple black dress amid the lavish space, with its red velvet walls and glittering crystal chandeliers, while Gabriel ordered a bottle of wine that probably cost more than her entire old monthly wage at Black Diamond. Yet he did not show off or boast. He was simply accustomed to luxury as if it were the air he breathed. And they ate in silence for a while, a silence that was not awkward but strangely comfortable, as if neither of them felt the need to fill it with meaningless words. And then Gabriel set his glass down, looked out the large window at the glowing city of New York below, and began to speak, telling her about his father, Anthony Cross, a man who had built the foundation of the empire back in the 1970s, when New York was still a chaotic city where the law belonged to the strongest. And Anthony Cross was not a good man by ordinary standards, but he was fair. He kept his word, and when he shook someone's hand, that promise was stronger than any contract. And he had a friend, a partner who stood beside him for 20 years, a man he trusted like a brother whose name was Marco Vega. And Gabriel paused, and Scarlett saw his jaw tighten at the name. Marco Vega, the father of Lorenzo Vega, the Western boss, Scarlett had heard mentioned in meetings. And that night Gabriel was 18, and had just returned from his girlfriend's birthday party, when he found his father lying on the floor in a pool of blood, because Marco Vega had stabbed his closest friend in the back, taken a third of the empire and fled west before anyone could react. And Anthony Cross died in his son's arms, his last words telling him to remember that in this world trust is the rarest luxury and betrayal is the cheapest currency. And Gabriel continued in a low, even voice as if he were reading someone else's story and not his own, saying that at 18 he had nothing but the Cross name and a burning hatred. The loyal had turned away. The fearful had begun to mock him. The hidden enemies had stepped into the open to fight for what remained, but he did not run, did not retreat, did not beg, and he killed his first man on his 19th birthday, a former subordinate of his father who had betrayed him for Vega. And he remembered the heat of the blood on his hands, the terror in the traitor's eyes, the way he did not shake or cry or feel anything except a cold emptiness. And from that moment he rebuilt the Cross Empire from the ashes, one brick at a time, with blood and tears and the ruthlessness the world demanded. And 19 years, he said, looking into Scarlett's eyes for the first time since he began. 19 years to build everything you see today, and I still have not paid my debt to Marco Vega. And Scarlett sat in silence, not knowing what to say, seeing for the first time the crack in the cold armor of the man New York feared, seeing the 18-year-old boy holding his dying father, the 19-year-old forced to kill to survive, the 37-year-old still carrying the pain and loneliness of nearly 2 decades without trusting anyone. And she said softly that she understood, and she truly did, because her own father had been killed in front of her when she was 12. And Gabriel looked at her, and his gray eyes softened for the first time. And between two people who had lost too much, an invisible bond began to form, fragile yet real, as if they had found in each other something they both believed no longer existed in this world. 3 weeks after that dinner, as the relationship between Gabriel and Scarlett was slowly becoming more intimate through shared meals and late-night conversations, a shadow from the past suddenly appeared. Scarlett was sitting in Gabriel's office, presenting the monthly financial report, when the door flew open, and Victor Rossi entered with a tension on his face that was rare for him. He told Gabriel that Lorenzo Vega was in the lobby asking to see him, that he had arrived with 5 bodyguards and declared he would not leave until he was granted a meeting. Scarlett saw the way Gabriel's body stiffened, the way his gray eyes shifted from warmth to steel cold in an instant, the way his hand clenched into a fist on the desk. Lorenzo Vega, the son of Marco Vega, the man who had killed his father. "Let him up," Gabriel said without a trace of emotion, "and increase security at every exit. 5 minutes later, the office door opened and Lorenzo Vega walked in as if he owned the place. The 55-year-old Western boss, with salt and pepper hair slicked back and a white suit that stood out against the dark tones of the room, was the complete opposite of Gabriel. If Gabriel was darkness, then Vega was a kind of blinding artificial light. If Gabriel was cold and restrained, then Vega was excessive and theatrical. 2 bodyguards stopped at the door when Victor signaled, and Vega entered alone, his smile wide and false. "Gabriel, it has been a long time," Vega said in a voice like honey laced with poison. "You have grown since the last time I saw you. Come to think of it, the last time was your father's funeral, was it not?" Gabriel did not stand, did not offer a hand, did not show any courtesy. He only looked at Vega with ice-cold eyes and asked what he wanted. Vega laughed, unbothered by the hostility, and began to talk about a proposal of cooperation, about sharing territory, about how the 2 families should put the past behind them and unite against new forces rising. Scarlett sat still in the corner trying to make herself invisible, but she felt the moment Vega's gaze slid over her and stopped. The Western boss tilted his head, studying her with undisguised interest as if appraising merchandise in a shop. "And who is this girl?" Vega asked, interrupting his own speech. "I do not recall seeing her here before." "A bodyguard, or something more interesting." "My financial advisor," Gabriel replied shortly, his voice turning a few degrees colder. Vega raised his brows, surprise mixed with intrigue. "Interesting," he said, stepping toward Scarlett as if Gabriel did not exist. "I am in need of someone like her for my organization. Smart, young, and clearly capable if Gabriel is willing to keep her here. What do you think about lending her to me for a few months, so I can see how she works?" Scarlett felt a chill run down her spine as Vega approached, instinct sounding alarms in her mind. She was about to speak when Gabriel stood up and the air in the room abruptly changed. The East Coast boss stepped out from behind the desk, each step slow and threatening, until he stood between Vega and Scarlett like an unbreakable wall. "She is mine," Gabriel said, each word falling heavy as stone. "Never mention her again. Never look at her again. Never think about her again." Vega stopped, his smile freezing for a moment before returning to its familiar false shape. He lifted his hands in a gesture of surrender, saying he understood, that he meant no offense, that he was only proposing a business deal. Gabriel stepped closer, close enough that Scarlett could see Vega forcing himself not to step back. "Leave," Gabriel said, his voice low like a beast's growl, "and tell the people you are keeping inside my organization that I know who they are. The purge will come sooner than they think." Scarlett saw a flash of panic in Vega's eyes, just for an instant before it was hidden behind confidence, and she understood that Gabriel had just declared war. While Gabriel was protecting Scarlett in front of Lorenzo Vega, a darker plot was taking shape in the shadows of the Cross organization itself. That night, after Cross Tower had fallen into silence and most employees had gone home, Richard Castellano slipped out of his office and went to a small bar in Brooklyn where Thomas Burke and a stranger were already waiting in a shadowed corner. The stranger was Jonathan Reed, the former director at Sterling Financial who had destroyed Scarlett's career 2 years earlier. Richard had spent nearly a week uncovering the link between Scarlett and Jonathan Reed, digging through the past of the waitress who had dared to outshine him, and when he found it, he knew he now held the perfect weapon to destroy her. Jonathan Reed sat there with a venomous smile, still bitter after 2 years, because a subordinate had dared to refuse him. When Richard told him that Scarlett was now working as a financial advisor to Gabriel Cross with a salary of $200,000 a year, Reed's face flushed red with jealousy and rage. He was ready to do anything to pull Scarlett down, to prove she did not deserve any success, to avenge his wounded ego. The 3 men whispered their scheme under the dim lights when the bar door opened and a 4th man entered. James Morrison, 35 years old, one of Gabriel's advisors, whom Scarlett had barely noticed because he always appeared calm and loyal. But James Morrison carried a secret no one in the Cross organization knew, that he had been secretly working for Lorenzo Vega for 3 years, feeding him internal information in exchange for a large sum of money and the promise of a higher position when Vega finally swallowed the Cross Empire. James sat with the conspirators and the secret meeting truly began. Richard laid out the plan in a voice thick with hatred. First, they would use Jonathan Reed to spread rumors about Scarlett's past, about her being fired for financial fraud, about the accusations Reed had fabricated to ruin her. They would make Gabriel doubt her, plant the seeds of distrust in the growing bond between them. But James Morrison shook his head and said Gabriel would not easily believe rumors, that the boss was too intelligent to be fooled by cheap tricks. They needed a different approach, more direct, more ruthless. Thomas Burke, with his violent nature and his love of solving everything with his fists, suggested that they kidnap Scarlett and deliver her to Vega as a gift and a declaration of war on Gabriel. That would push the East Coast boss into losing control, making mistakes, and then Vega would strike and devour everything. Richard hesitated for a second, not out of conscience but out of fear of the consequences if they failed. But James reassured him, saying Vega had promised to protect everyone who stood with him, that when the Cross Empire fell, they would be the ones ruling the ruins under Vega's banner. At last the four traitors shook hands in the dark, an unspoken pact sealed by greed and hatred. They would wait for the moment, watch Scarlett, find the instant when she was away from Gabriel's protection, and then they would act. Jonathan Reed left the bar with a satisfied smile, imagining the day he would finally see Scarlett Hayes crushed as she deserved. Richard and Thomas returned to Cross Tower, pretending to be loyal advisors while silently counting down the time. And James Morrison sent an encrypted message to Lorenzo Vega, confirming that the plan was in motion, that the prey would soon fall into the trap. None of them knew that Scarlett, with the sharp eyes that had once seen through the numbers they tried to hide, would soon discover the darkness closing in around her from every side. While darkness was gathering behind their backs, Scarlett and Gabriel were stepping into a light neither of them had expected. After the confrontation with Lorenzo Vega, something shifted between them, as if Gabriel's public defense of her against his most dangerous enemy had broken the last wall between them. Dinners meant for work slowly became real dates. Conversations about finance gave way to stories of childhood, of dreams, of fears both had carried in silence for years. Gabriel, the mafia boss New York feared, became a different man with Scarlett. He smiled more, though his smiles were still as rare as winter sunshine. He spoke more, about the books he read, the films he loved, the small house in the suburbs his father had once promised to build for the family before everything collapsed, and he touched her more. Small gestures like a hand at her back, guiding her through a doorway, pulling her closer as they walked through a quiet park late at night, kissing her forehead before saying goodbye. Scarlett realized she was in love, a feeling both sweet and frightening. She loved a dangerous man, a man with blood on his hands, a man whose world could swallow her at any moment. But she also loved the man who had seen her when no one else had, who had trusted her when no one else had, who had saved her mother without asking for anything in return but loyalty. 1 month after the surgery, when Helen Hayes was well enough to return home, Gabriel offered to take Scarlett to visit her mother. She hesitated, unsure how to explain this man to her mother, her job, the world she was now living in. But Gabriel only took her hand and said he wanted to meet the woman who had raised her, that he wanted to know her family as she knew his past. They went to the small apartment in Brooklyn on a Sunday afternoon, Gabriel in a simple white shirt instead of his usual black suit, carrying a bouquet of white roses and a box of pastries from the bakery Scarlett had once said her mother loved most. Helen Hayes opened the door, her face still hollow after months of fighting illness, but her eyes lit up when she saw her daughter. Then she saw Gabriel behind her, tall and commanding even in simple clothes, and surprise crossed her face. Scarlett introduced Gabriel as the man she was dating, said nothing about his work, nothing about the mafia, only that he was kind and cared deeply for her. Helen was quiet for a moment, her eyes studying Gabriel with the caution of a mother who had seen her daughter hurt too many times. Then she noticed the way Gabriel's hand rested protectively on Scarlett's shoulder, the way he looked at her daughter as if she were the most precious thing in the world, and a small smile appeared. She invited them in, made tea, and began asking Gabriel about his life, the simple questions a mother asks a daughter's partner. Gabriel answered carefully, not lying but not revealing too much, and Scarlett saw how he tried, how he wanted to be accepted, how he was doing this for her. When they left, Helen hugged Scarlett and whispered that she did not know what he did for a living and did not need to. She only knew he looked at her the way her father had once looked at her mother, and that was enough. Scarlett held her mother tightly, tears on her cheeks, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt that life was giving her a chance to be happy. Happiness is the most fragile thing in the world, and Scarlett should have known that better than anyone, because only a few days after the warm visit with her mother, while she was still savoring the sweetness of love in bloom, darkness began to reveal itself from corners she never expected. And that night, Scarlett stayed late at the office to finish the quarterly financial report, while Gabriel had left earlier for a security meeting with Victor, and she sat alone in the quiet room, with the computer screen glowing blue in the dark, when an unusual email alert appeared. The automatic warning system she had installed the week before to monitor suspicious transactions had just detected a large midnight transfer. $150,000 moved from the Cross organization's main account to a shell company in the Cayman Islands she had never seen in any official records. And Scarlett began tracing the transaction, her sharp eyes scanning hundreds of data lines. And what she found made her blood run cold, because the shell company was linked to a complex web of 6 others that all led back to one name she had long suspected, Richard Castellano. And that was not all, because as she dug deeper she stumbled upon a hidden folder containing encrypted emails sent from an internal address. The sender was James Morrison, and the recipient was an unknown address, but the contents made Scarlett cover her mouth to keep from screaming, because James was leaking confidential information about Gabriel's schedule, transport routes, and security weaknesses, all sent to someone he called by a code name, but whom Scarlett was smart enough to recognize as Lorenzo Vega. And she immediately grabbed her phone to call Gabriel, her heart pounding like a war drum, and her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. But before the call could connect, the office door burst open with a dry crack, and Thomas Burke stood there with a cruel smile. Two large men Scarlett had never seen before behind him, asking in a mocking tone where she was going so late, whether she was working overtime or poking into things that were not hers. And Scarlett stood up and backed away behind the desk, trying to keep her voice steady as she asked what he wanted. But she already knew, from the predator look in his eyes, from the way the two men were moving closer, from the way the door had been locked behind them. And Thomas did not answer. He only nodded, and the two men lunged at Scarlett like hunting beasts. She tried to fight, tried to scream, but a rough hand clamped over her mouth while another crushed her throat until she could barely breathe. A needle pierced her neck, cold and sharp, and the world began to spin, and before slipping into darkness, Scarlett saw Thomas Burke smile, saw him pick up her phone and throw it to the floor, saw the computer screen still glowing with the evidence of betrayal she had uncovered. And she tried to call Gabriel's name, but no sound left her lips, and then everything went black, and Scarlett Hayes vanished from Cross Tower as if she had never existed. Her shattered phone lay on the floor. The call to Gabriel never connected, and the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast had no idea that the woman he loved had just been dragged into hell by the very men he was sheltering under his own roof. Scarlett woke in suffocating darkness, her head pounding as if struck by a hammer, and her throat burning dry as if she had swallowed sand. And when she tried to move, she realized her hands were tied tightly behind the chair with rope that had cut off circulation. Her legs were bound to the chair legs, and a filthy rag was stuffed into her mouth so that breathing was almost impossible. And the room around her was damp and cold with gray concrete walls and no windows, only a weak ceiling bulb casting a pale yellow circle of light where she sat. And she did not know where she was or how long it had been since she was taken, only that she was in enemy hands, and Gabriel did not know where she was. And the metal door creaked open, and Lorenzo Vega walked in, his white suit a blinding streak in the gloom, with Thomas Burke behind him wearing a cruel smile and the two large men who had abducted her the night before. And Vega pulled a chair in front of Scarlett and sat down with the calm air of someone about to drink tea, rather than torture a woman, and he nodded for Thomas to remove the gag. And Scarlett coughed violently, trying to drag the stale air into her lungs. And Vega said, in a voice that was gentle and therefore terrifying, that he had heard she had discovered James and Richard before they could act, and that it was a pity she had not been fast enough. And Scarlett stared straight into his eyes and asked what he wanted, forcing her voice not to shake. And Vega smiled a cold smile that did not reach his eyes and listed what he needed: the access codes to Gabriel Cross's secret accounts, Gabriel's schedule for the coming week, information about the security system at Cross Tower, and most of all, Gabriel's weakness, whatever could make the East Coast boss lose control and make mistakes. And Scarlett did not answer but only looked at him with eyes like ice, while inside she was shaking with fear. And Vega sighed as if disappointed and nodded to Thomas, and the first punch drove into Scarlett's stomach and knocked the breath from her lungs. The second split her lip and blood ran down her chin. The third, the fourth, the fifth came harder than the last, and Scarlett clenched her teeth to keep from screaming, to keep them from seeing her break. And between waves of pain she thought of her mother, of Helen Hayes's face when she said she was proud. She thought of Tommy trying to recover, and of her promise to stay with him. She thought of Gabriel's gray eyes looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, of the way he said she belonged to me in front of Vega, of the nights he told her his pain and trusted someone for the first time in 19 years. And she knew she could not betray them, could not betray Gabriel. Even if she died, she would not speak. And Thomas stopped, breathing hard, and looked to Vega for what came next. And Vega stood, stepped close, took Scarlett's chin and forced her to look at him, and said softly that she was protecting a murderer, that Gabriel Cross was a monster who would never change and she would die for him and gain nothing. And Scarlett spat blood into Vega's face, and said hoarsely that his father had killed Gabriel's father, and that he had no right to call anyone a monster. And Vega's face hardened, and he wiped the blood away with a pristine white handkerchief, and turned and walked out, telling Thomas to continue until she spoke or until she died. He did not care which came first, and the door closed, and Thomas moved toward Scarlett with a brutal smile. And Scarlett closed her eyes, thought of Gabriel, and prepared herself for what was coming. Gabriel knew something was wrong when Scarlett did not answer the phone for the 5th time. She had never missed his call, never failed to reply even with a single word, never vanished without saying anything. He left the meeting in the middle, ignoring the startled looks of his associates, and rushed back to Cross Tower at a speed that made the driver pray under his breath. When he reached Scarlett's office and saw the door standing open, the shattered phone on the floor, and the signs of a struggle, Gabriel Cross's world collapsed. He stood there for a long, endless moment, gray eyes fixed on the broken phone as if he could not believe what he was seeing. And then a roar tore out of his chest, the sound of a wounded beast, of a man losing the most precious thing in his life. He flipped the desk, smashed the computer screen, hurled a chair through the glass window, and shouted with a force that made the 35th floor tremble. Victor Rossi ran in, and for the first time in 20 years of serving Gabriel, he saw his boss completely lose control. Gabriel grabbed the nearest guard by the collar and screamed at him, demanding to know why no one had protected her, why no one had seen anything, how she could disappear inside his own building without anyone knowing. Victor had to use all his strength to pull Gabriel away, to hold the trembling man in his arms, to speak into his ear that they needed to stay calm, that losing control would not save Scarlett, that they had to find who had done this and where she was. Gabriel stood still, breathing hard, eyes wild like a wolf cornered. Then he looked at the shattered computer screen, at the documents still visible before they were destroyed, and he understood. Scarlett had discovered something. She had found the traitor, and they had taken her before she could speak. Richard Castellano, Thomas Burke, James Morrison, 3 names flared in Gabriel's mind like death sentences. He ordered Victor to summon all security, to check the cameras, to trace Scarlett by every possible means. But the cameras had been disabled, the trail erased, and the 3 traitors had vanished as if they had never existed. Gabriel stood in the wrecked office, his fists clenched until blood ran from his palms. When the door opened and Diana Martinez ran in, her young face wet with tears and fear. Diana said she knew something, that she had seen Thomas Burke meeting a stranger in the basement the night before, that she had heard them mention an old warehouse at the southern docks where Vega often held people he wanted to interrogate. Diana trembled as she spoke, knowing this could make her the next target, but she could not let her best friend die without trying. Scarlett had protected her when Thomas harassed her, shared food when she could not afford lunch, been the only person at Black Diamond who treated her like a human being. Now it was Diana's turn to protect Scarlett, even if it meant putting her own life in danger. Gabriel looked at Diana, and for the first time there was a spark of hope in his gray eyes. He put a hand on the young woman's shoulder and told her he would not forget this, that he owed her a life. Then he turned to Victor, his voice cold as ice but filled with resolve, and ordered him to assemble the strike team, prepare the weapons, and head to the southern docks immediately. Tonight Gabriel Cross would lead his men himself, and those who had dared to touch the woman he loved would pay in blood. The old warehouse at the southern docks lay silent in the darkness, its moss-stained red brick walls hiding inside the crimes the light never reached. Gabriel arrived with 20 men, all of them his most loyal fighters, armed to the teeth and ready to die on his command. But Gabriel did not need them to fight for him. He needed them to seal the perimeter and make sure no one escaped alive, because tonight Gabriel Cross would do it himself. He would kill with his own hands everyone who had dared to touch Scarlett. He would write the death sentences of the traitors in their own blood. The raid began at 2 a.m, when the night was thickest and the guards were at their most exhausted. Victor led the rear assault team while Gabriel kicked in the front door and walked inside like a god of vengeance from hell. Gunshots tore through the night. There were screams, curses, bodies collapsing onto the cold concrete floor. Gabriel moved through the chaos like a lethal shadow, the gun in his hand firing with ruthless precision, each bullet a life, each step another corpse behind him. He felt nothing, no fear, no hesitation, only one burning purpose in his mind: find Scarlett, save Scarlett, kill anyone who stood between him and her. He found Thomas Burke trying to flee through the back exit and shot him in the knee, watched the man fall screaming in pain, then walked up to him and asked in a voice cold as ice where Scarlett was. Thomas cried and begged and pointed toward the last room down the corridor, and Gabriel rewarded him with a bullet to the head before moving on. He kicked open the iron door, and what he saw inside stopped his heart for a long, endless moment. Scarlett was sitting there, bound to a chair, her face bruised and bloody, her lips split, one eye swollen shut, her clothes torn and soaked with blood. She was barely recognizable, her body trembling like a wounded bird. But when she heard his footsteps and looked up, when she saw Gabriel standing in the doorway like a dark angel come to save her, her swollen green eyes lit with a faint spark of hope. Gabriel ran to her, his hands shaking as he cut through the ropes, biting into her skin. And when the last rope fell away, he pulled her into his arms as if afraid she would vanish if he let go. Scarlett leaned against his chest, too weak to speak, too hurt to cry, able only to breathe and feel the warmth of the man holding her, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I am sorry," Gabriel whispered into her hair, his voice shaking in a way no one had ever heard before, the voice of a man breaking apart. "I am sorry I did not protect you. I am sorry I let them touch you. I am sorry." And then something that should not have been possible happened. Gabriel Cross, the mafia boss who never cried, the man who had buried his feelings for 19 years since his father died in his arms, the man who killed without blinking and watched enemies fall without a tremor, cried. Tears ran down his cold face and fell into Scarlett's blood-soaked hair. And he did not hide them or wipe them away. He only held her tighter and let the first tears in almost 2 decades wash through the icy armor he had built around his heart. "You are safe now," Gabriel said, his voice thick with emotion, but full of promise. "No one will ever touch you again. I swear to you." Scarlett did not answer. She only clutched his jacket with trembling fingers and closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to be weak in the arms of the man she loved. The days that followed were hell for the traitors and a time of healing for Scarlett. And Gabriel took her to his private penthouse at the top of Cross Tower, a place he had never allowed anyone to enter before, and hired the best private doctors in New York to care for her around the clock. And while Scarlett lay in bed as her wounds slowly healed, Gabriel dealt with those who had caused her suffering in a way the underworld would never forget, because Richard Castellano and James Morrison were captured within 48 hours of the rescue. Gabriel did not forget the man who had started Scarlett's descent into hell. Jonathan Reed was intercepted at the airport while attempting to flee to Europe. Gabriel ensured that before Reed met his end, he witnessed the total collapse of his reputation and the legal dismantling of Sterling Financial, the very empire of lies he had used to crush Scarlett. Alongside Richard and James, Reed was forced to face the slowest and most painful justice Gabriel could devise, ensuring that every person who had conspired in the dark bar that night paid their debt in full. Gabriel did not kill them quickly, as he had Thomas Burke, but left them to Victor to be handled in the slowest and most painful way possible, in a way where every minute felt like a year in hell for a traitor. And 3 days later, their bodies were found in different parts of the city, bearing the marks of prolonged torture and a small handwritten note that said, "This is the fate of those who dare to touch what belongs to Gabriel Cross." And the message spread through the underworld like wildfire from New York to Los Angeles, from Chicago to Miami, until everyone understood that the East Coast boss had drawn a line no one could cross, and Lorenzo Vega vanished from New York the same night as the rescue, and fled back west with his tail between his legs, knowing he had lost this war and that Gabriel would never forgive him. But none of that mattered to Gabriel now, because the only thing that mattered was that Scarlett was healing, and he stayed with her every day, from morning until night, neglecting his work, neglecting his empire, neglecting everything, to sit by her bed, hold her hand while she slept, read to her while she was awake, and watch the bruises on her face slowly fade. And he changed her bandages, himself, fed her himself. When she was too weak to hold a spoon, carried her himself from the bed to the armchair by the window, so she could look out over the city. And these were things Gabriel Cross, the famously ruthless mafia boss, had never done for anyone in his life, and he did them without complaint and without hesitation. And Scarlett watched him care for her with wonder and emotion, feeling his love not through words but through every small action, every worried look, every gentle touch, as if afraid to hurt her. And 2 weeks after the rescue, when Scarlett could finally walk again though still weak, Helen Hayes and Tommy came to visit, because Gabriel had sent someone to bring them from Brooklyn, and made sure they knew nothing of what had truly happened, telling them only that Scarlett had been in a car accident and was recovering. And Helen held her daughter and cried, her trembling hands brushing the fading bruises on Scarlett's face, while Tommy stood behind her with red eyes and clenched fists. The 17-year-old who had successfully completed rehabilitation after 3 months, and whose first act of freedom was to come see the sister he had almost lost. And Gabriel stood in the corner, quietly watching the family reunite. And Helen saw the way he looked at her. Daughter saw the pain and worry still hidden in his gray eyes, saw the true love of a man willing to do anything to protect the woman he loved. And she stepped to him and placed a hand on his arm and thanked him for saving her daughter, saying she did not know what had truly happened, and did not need to know. She only knew her daughter was alive because of him. And Gabriel looked at the small woman with hair touched by gray, and eyes that had cried too much, and he nodded without words because none were enough. And that night, after Helen and Tommy had gone, Scarlett lay in Gabriel's arms and whispered that she loved him, that she regretted nothing, that if she could choose again, she would still choose him, knowing all that would happen. And Gabriel held her tighter and said he would spend the rest of his life becoming worthy of her, protecting her and loving her in the way she deserved to be loved. A year passed like a dream, and Scarlett Hayes was no longer the girl pouring drinks for $9 an hour. She had become the chief financial officer of the entire Cross Empire, the second most powerful woman after Gabriel himself, the one who transformed shadowy operations into legitimate projects that doubled profits. And under her guidance, Cross Corporation slowly moved from the underworld into the light, from illegal casinos to chains of five-star hotels, from predatory lending to real estate investment funds. And Gabriel watched her run his empire with undisguised admiration, trusting her completely and loving her more with each passing day. And on a spring night, when the lights of New York shimmered like millions of scattered stars below them, Gabriel led Scarlett up to the rooftop of Cross Tower, where he had prepared thousands of red and white roses arranged into a giant heart. And Scarlett stood there with the wind in her hair, looking at the man she loved with wonder and emotion. And Gabriel took her hands and looked into the green eyes he had fallen in love with the first moment she dared to meet his gaze and speak the truth. And then he did what the Mafia boss had never done for anyone in his life. He knelt, and he said, "Scarlett, you have changed me in ways I never thought possible. You turned a monster into a man who wants to be worthy of your love. You gave me a reason to live, to hope, to believe that even someone like me can be redeemed." And he opened a black velvet box, revealing a simple but exquisite 5-carat diamond ring glittering under the city lights. And he asked her to marry him. And Scarlett cried and nodded because she could not speak, and then finally whispered, "Yes," through tears of happiness. And the wedding took place 3 months later in a ceremony that was elegant but private, with only their closest loved ones present. And Helen Hayes cried through the entire ceremony with the happy tears of a mother who had finally seen her daughter find her place. And Tommy, now 18 and healthy after a year of successful recovery, stood as best man, with pride in his smile. And Diana was maid of honor, and Victor Rossi stood beside Gabriel with a rare smile on his usually cold face. But the most beautiful moment was not the wedding. It was 6 months later when Scarlett and Gabriel opened the Hayes Cross Foundation, a charitable organization built on the site of the old cafe at the Black Diamond Club, where Scarlett once poured drinks for $9 an hour. And the foundation offered scholarships to working people who wanted to study but lacked the means, supported families with loved ones in recovery, and helped women escaping domestic abuse rebuild their lives. And Diana was appointed executive director, a fitting role for the woman who had risked her life to save her friend. And on the opening day, as Scarlett stood in the new training center, looking at the hopeful faces of those who would be helped, a shy young woman approached her, wearing the same black service uniform Scarlett once wore, with eyes downcast, shoulders drawn in as if trying to be small and invisible. And she asked softly how Scarlett had gone from a waitress to everything she was now. And Scarlett looked at her and saw herself from a year before, the fear and doubt and buried dreams beneath the simple uniform. And she smiled and said she had spoken one sentence that changed everything, a sentence that took only 30 seconds of courage, and that the young woman could do the same. And Gabriel came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, and they looked out together at the city below. And Scarlett said, "Sometimes all it takes is 30 seconds of courage, and someone willing to listen." And Gabriel kissed her hair and added with a rare smile and a little spilled wine to start it all. And Scarlett laughed with the clear, joyful laughter of a woman who had found where she belonged, found true love, and turned tragedy into triumph. And the young woman looked at them with shining hope, knowing that one day she too would find her own 30 seconds of courage. And the story of Scarlett and Gabriel ended with a fulfilled ending, but its message would live on, because life is never easy. And sometimes we are pushed to the very bottom, dismissed, humiliated, stripped of everything we once had. But it is in the darkest moments that we discover our true strength, and Scarlett taught us that origins do not define us, that a prestigious degree can be ignored but knowledge is never lost, that pride is not the same as arrogance, and most of all that sometimes all it takes to change an entire life is 30 seconds of courage to speak the truth. And what about you? How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of moments in your own life when you were underestimated or overlooked, despite knowing your worth? Share with us in the comments below, because we truly want to hear what is in your heart. And if this story touched you, please like and share it with those you love so they too can find inspiration and strength in Scarlett's journey. And do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss our stories each day. Thank you for staying with us from beginning to end. We wish you good health and peace and happiness every day. And remember, wherever you are in life and whatever you are facing, 30 seconds of courage can change everything. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.